In Morrison's family market, a 15-year-old girl was about to face her worst nightmare. What started as routine Sunday grocery shopping turned deadly when three violent thugs cornered her in the cereal aisle. Emily Seagal wasn't your typical teenager's granddaughter. For 40 years, her grandfather was Steven Seagal, legendary martial artist and action star, known for his bone-crushing aikido mastery and zero-tolerance approach to bullies. When the gang leader slapped Emily and threatened to cave her skull in, they had no idea they were facing down a living weapon. Steven emerged from the shadows with surgical precision that would remind the world why legends never truly retire. What began as a simple act of teenage bullying would become viral justice. The supermarket and the internet would never be the same after 5 minutes of perfectly calculated violence served cold in aisle 7. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun hung lazy over the cracked asphalt of Morrison's family market, casting long shadows between the scattered shopping carts and rusted light poles. The air smelled of summer heat and distant barbecue smoke drifting from the trailer park 3 blocks east. Sunday in the Midwest moved like thick honey. Slow, deliberate, predictable. Emily Seagal pushed through the glass doors, her yellow hoodie 2 sizes too big hanging loose around her small frame, the fabric worn soft from too many washes, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows revealing thin, pale arms that had never seen a gym membership or a fight. She clutched a crumpled grocery list in one hand, written in her own careful script: milk, bread, eggs, soup for Grandpa. The canvas tote, slung over her shoulder, sagged empty, waiting to be filled. Her white sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as she grabbed a shopping cart from the tangled cluster near the entrance. The wheels wobbled, one spinning lazy circles as she guided it toward the produce section. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that harsh, clinical glow that made even fresh apples look sickly. Emily moved through the store with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before. She knew which aisles to avoid. The ones where teenage boys from school might be loitering near the energy drinks. She knew which cashier lanes moved fastest and which ones would let her slide with a handful of coupons, even if they were expired. She was 15, but carried herself like someone much older, someone who had learned early that the world was not particularly interested in making things easy. What Emily did not know was that she was being watched. Steven Seagal stood near the entrance, leaning against a display of discounted Halloween candy, his presence so unremarkable that shoppers moved around him without a second glance. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, unbuttoned over a plain white t-shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with old muscle and faded scars. His jeans were worn soft at the knees, his boots scuffed leather that had walked through decades of bad decisions and worse outcomes. His hair, gray, now hung past his shoulders, caught back in a loose ponytail that made him look like any other aging hippie drifting through small-town America. But his eyes were different. They tracked every movement in the store, cataloging faces, memorizing exits, calculating distances and angles without conscious thought. It was an old habit, one that had kept him alive through years when staying alive was not guaranteed. He watched Emily select a bag of apples, turning each one over in her hands, checking for bruises the way her grandmother had taught her before the cancer had taken her too. He watched her pause at the bread aisle, reaching for the cheap white loaf, then changing her mind and grabbing the whole wheat because she knew it was better for him, even if it cost more. A faint smile ghosted across his weathered features. She was growing up responsible in ways that made his chest tight with pride and worry. She was too young to be shopping alone, too young to be walking these streets after dark, too young to carry the weight of taking care of an old man who should have been taking care of her. But Emily had never known any other way of living, and Steven had learned long ago that protecting someone sometimes meant letting them think they were protecting themselves. The automatic doors hissed open again, and Steven's attention sharpened. 3 young men walked in, moving with the swagger of people who had never faced real consequences. The leader was thick-necked and broad-shouldered, his arms covered in cheap tattoos that looked like they had been done in someone's garage. His tank top was stained with motor oil and arrogance. His jeans sagged low, showing off boxer shorts with skulls grinning from the fabric. Behind him, 2 smaller men followed like hyenas, trailing a lion. All nervous energy and loud laughter that cut through the store's peaceful hum. Steven recognized the type immediately: predators who hunted in packs, who fed on fear and weakness, who had never learned the difference between strength and cruelty. The leader's name was Jace, though Steven would not learn this until later when the police reports were filed and the video footage was reviewed. For now, he was simply a threat moving through the store like a storm system building pressure, looking for something to break against. Jace knocked over a display of soup cans near the entrance, laughing as they rolled across the floor. An elderly woman with a walker had to step carefully around them. He did not apologize, did not even look back, just kept moving deeper into the store, his voice carrying over the soft music playing from hidden speakers. "This place is a dump," he announced to no one in particular. "Bet they don't even card for beer." Steven watched them progress through the store, noting how other shoppers instinctively moved away, creating space around the three men like animals, avoiding a brush fire. Mothers pulled their children closer. Elderly couples found sudden interest in studying product labels. Teenagers buried their faces deeper in their phones. Everyone felt the danger, even if they could not name it. Everyone except Emily, who was focused on her list, completely unaware that trouble was walking straight toward her. The fluorescent lights hummed a little louder. The air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical sigh. Somewhere in the back of the store, a stock boy dropped a case of bottles and swore softly. Sunday afternoon in Morrison's Family Market continued its slow, lazy rhythm, but underneath the surface, tension was building like pressure in a boiler, and Steven Seagal stood perfectly still watching his granddaughter shop for groceries, while three predators circled closer to her aisle. Emily rounded the corner into the cereal aisle, her cart wheels clicking against the joins in the linoleum floor. She moved with the unconscious grace of youth, pausing to check prices, comparing brands the way her grandfather had taught her. Every dollar counted in their small household, and she had learned to stretch a budget like her grandmother had once stretched dough for Sunday bread. The bright boxes of sugar-coated promises towered around her, creating a canyon of color and artificial flavors. She was reaching for a box of generic cornflakes when the collision happened. Jace slammed into her cart with his hip, not an accident despite how it might have looked to casual observers. The metal basket skidded sideways, cans of soup rolling across the floor. A loaf of bread tumbled out and landed at his feet. Emily stumbled backward, her hand flying out to catch herself against the shelf behind her. The movement was instinctive, graceful, even in surprise, but her face immediately flushed with embarrassment and something else, something that looked like fear to anyone who knew how to read body language. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Emily said immediately, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. She bent down to gather the scattered items, her yellow hoodie falling forward around her face like a curtain. "I didn't see you coming. I'm really sorry." Jay stood over her, his thick frame casting a shadow across the aisle floor. His friends Clay and Benny flanked him like bookends, both of them grinning with the kind of ugly anticipation that came from watching someone else's humiliation unfold. Clay was skinny with arms like sticks covered in homemade tattoos that looked more like prison work than art. Benny was shorter, rounder, his face already flushed with excitement at the coming show. They had done this before in different stores, different towns, different victims, but always the same script, always the same ending. "Sorry." Jace's voice cut through the aisle like broken glass, sharp and jagged. "You think sorry fixes this?" He gestured at the scattered groceries with theatrical outrage. "You think you can just run into people and say sorry and everything's cool?" Emily looked up from where she knelt on the floor, gathering cans, her eyes wide with confusion and growing alarm. "I didn't run into you," she said quietly. "You bumped my cart." The words came out before she could stop them, a moment of honesty that she immediately regretted as Jace's face darkened with manufactured rage. "What did you just say? To me?" His voice rose, carrying across the store. Heads turned in their direction, other shoppers suddenly finding reasons to examine products in nearby aisles, their faces carefully neutral, their body language screaming discomfort. "Did you just call me a liar?" Clay laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "She called you a liar, dude. She's calling you out." Benny nodded eagerly. "Disrespectful little brat thinks she's better than us." Emily's hands shook as she tried to gather her groceries. Faster, her movements becoming clumsy with panic. A can of tomato soup rolled away from her fingers and came to rest against a pair of scuffed leather boots. She looked up, following the boots to faded jeans, to a red flannel shirt, to eyes that were watching everything with the stillness of deep water. Steven Seagal had moved without anyone noticing him, flowing between the aisles like smoke until he stood at the end of the cereal section, partially hidden behind a display of breakfast bars. His posture was casual, relaxed, one hand resting lightly on a shopping basket that contained nothing but shadows. In patience, he had positioned himself with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent years calculating angles and distances. His eyes never left his granddaughter's face, never left the growing circle of predators around her, but he did not move forward, not. Yet Emily felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let these strangers see her cry. She had learned early that tears were a luxury. She could not afford that. Weakness invited cruelty, the way blood invited sharks. "Please," she whispered, gathering the last of her groceries and trying to stand. "I just want to finish shopping." Jay stepped closer, invading her personal space. His breath smelled of energy drinks and stale cigarettes. "Oh, you want to finish shopping?" He mocked, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You want to just walk away after disrespecting me in front of my friends?" The store around them had gone quiet. Conversations died. Music seemed to lower its volume. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more softly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Other shoppers pretended to be absorbed in their tasks, but phones were being lifted, recording devices activated, though no one stepped forward to help. No one spoke up to intervene. They all watched with the fascination of people driving past a car accident, unable to look away, but unwilling to stop. Clay giggled like a child. "She's scared now, look at her shaking." Benny moved closer, completing the triangle around Emily. "Bet she's never been in a real fight before." Emily pressed herself against the cereal boxes behind her, the cardboard crinkling under the pressure of her shoulders. Her canvas tote clutched against her chest like armor that would never be thick enough. She looked around, desperately seeking escape, but the three men had positioned themselves to block her path, and the other shoppers had created a wide circle of empty space around the confrontation, as if violence was contagious, as if proximity to cruelty might infect them with responsibility. At the end of the aisle, Steven Seagal's breathing slowed. His shoulders settled into a familiar stillness that had preceded violence in a dozen countries and twice as many languages. His fingers flexed once against the handle of his empty shopping basket, then went still. The old reflexes were stirring, muscle memory awakening from a sleep that had lasted years, but not long enough. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The air conditioning cycled on with a mechanical sigh. Somewhere in the distance, a child cried and was quickly hushed. Sunday afternoon in Morrison's family market was about to become something else entirely, and Emily, trapped between the cereal boxes and three predators, finally understood that sorry was not going to be enough. Time moved like honey in the seconds before the slap, thick and golden and impossibly slow. Emily could see it coming, and Jace's eyes could read the intention in the way his weight shifted to his back foot, in the way his right hand drew back with theatrical precision. He wanted her to see it, wanted her to flinch, wanted the fear to bloom across her face like blood spreading through water. This was not about punishment or justice. This was about power and the sweet addiction of watching someone smaller break. The sound, when it came, was sharp and clean as breaking glass. Emily's head snapped to the side, her slight frame spinning with the force of the blow. Her yellow hoodie twisted around her shoulders as she stumbled backward, her hands flying up instinctively to shield her face. Too late, always too late. The carton of eggs she had been clutching exploded against the linoleum floor, shells and yolks spreading in a wet abstract painting across the polished surface. The bread loaf tumbled away, spinning like a discus thrown by a child. She hit the bottom shelf hard, her hip connecting with metal shelving that rang like a struck bell. Cans of soup rolled across the aisle floor, their labels bright and cheerful in the harsh fluorescent light. Green beans, tomatoes, chicken noodle, all the mundane necessities of life scattered and broken just like everything else. The store went silent, not quiet, silent, a complete absence of sound, as if someone had reached over and turned down the volume of the world. The music cut off mid-note, leaving only the mechanical hum of refrigeration units and the shocked intake of breath from a dozen witnesses. Phones lifted like salutes, pointing toward the spectacle, recording the moment when civilization revealed its paper-thin veneer, when the social contract dissolved into the law of the jungle. Emily pressed her hand to her cheek, feeling the heat of the handprint that would purple by morning, her eyes wide with shock and something deeper, something that looked like recognition, as if she had always known this moment would come, had always known that her careful Politeness and quiet compliance would not be enough to keep the wolves at bay. Her lip trembled, but she bit down on it hard enough to taste copper, refusing to give Jace the satisfaction of her tears. "There, Jace," said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "That's what happens when you disrespect me." He shook his hand, as if the slap had stung him too, as if violence was a two-way street, and he was the one who deserved sympathy. Clay and Benny laughed, their voices harsh and artificial, filling the quiet with ugly sound. Clay stepped closer, his phone held high, capturing every angle. "Do it again, dude." "She's still standing." Benny nodded eagerly. "Yeah, teach her some respect." The crowd of shoppers pressed closer, but not to help. They formed a loose circle around the violence like spectators at a cockfight, their faces lit by the glow of their phone screens, recording, uploading, sharing the moment when a 15-year-old girl learned that the world was not interested in protecting her, that safety was an illusion and kindness was a weakness that invited predation. A woman near the dairy section whispered, "Someone should call the police." But her voice was barely audible, and no one moved toward the customer service desk. No one dialed 911. They just watched and recorded and told themselves that it was not their problem, that getting involved would only make things worse, that someone else would surely act. At the end of the aisle, Steven Seagal felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been sleeping for years, stirring like a hibernating animal, awakening to the scent of spring. His breathing slowed to a rhythm that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with preparation. His hands relaxed at his sides, fingers loose and ready. His weight shifted almost imperceptibly to the balls of his feet. The old programming was coming online, systems that had been installed in youth and reinforced through decades of violence. Awakening like muscle memory, his eyes tracked movement, cataloged positions, calculated distances and angles and weaknesses the way a chess master saw the board. 10 moves ahead. Jace was 6 feet tall, maybe 200 pounds, soft around the middle, slow on his feet, favoring his right side, probably from an old injury. Clay was quick, but brittle, all nervous energy and no foundation. Benny was the follower, would run when the leader fell, but Steven did not move, not yet. He watched his granddaughter struggle to her feet, watched her gather her scattered dignity along with her groceries, watched her refuse to cry, even as her cheek bloomed red with the promise of bruises to come. She was strong, stronger than she knew, stronger than the world had any right to expect from someone so young. And for a moment, he felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. Then Jace raised his hand again. Emily flinched instinctively, covering her head with her arms, whispering something that might have been a prayer or might have been her mother's name. The gesture was so vulnerable, so heartbreakingly young, that something in Steven's chest cracked like ice under pressure. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating the second blow. Phones adjusted angles to capture the moment when a girl's spirit finally broke, when she learned that there was no cavalry coming, no hero waiting in the wings, just the brutal arithmetic of power and the silence of witnesses who chose not to see. And in that silence, in that moment when the world held its breath, waiting for cruelty to complete its work, Steven Seagal took his first step forward. His boot heel clicked against the linoleum floor, once soft and unremarkable, but somehow audible above the mechanical hum of the store, somehow carrying the weight of inevitability like the first note of a funeral dirge. The sound of Steven's first step cut through the store's mechanical hum like a blade through silence, one boot heel clicking against polished linoleum, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that made heads turn without conscious thought, made spines straighten with ancestral recognition of predators moving through tall grass. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in acknowledgement of something fundamental shifting in the ecosystem of Morrison's family market. Jace stood frozen with his hand raised midair, his attention still focused on Emily, crouched at his feet like a broken bird. But something in the quality of the silence around him had changed. The crowd's energy shifted from voyeuristic anticipation to something else, something that tasted like electricity before a lightning strike. Clay and Benny felt it too, their nervous laughter dying in their throats, their phones wavering as they looked around, trying to identify the source of their sudden unease. Steven took another step. This one was different, somehow heavier, carrying the weight of decision and consequence. His faded red flannel shirt hung loose on his frame, but underneath the casual clothing something was stirring, awakening like a machine that had been powered down but never truly shut off. His shoulders settled into a posture that spoke of decades of training, of muscle memory burned so deep it had become instinct. His breathing slowed to a rhythm that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with preparation. A woman near the frozen food section nudged her husband. "Is that?" she whispered, but the words died in her throat as her husband shook his head frantically, his eyes wide with recognition and something that looked like fear. Marla, the cashier at Register 3, had been watching the confrontation unfold with growing horror, her finger hovering over the panic button beneath her cash drawer, but now she found herself frozen not by fear, but by fascination as she watched a man she had seen a dozen times before buying milk and bread and generic aspirin transform into something else entirely, someone else entirely. Steven took a third step, and the crowd began to part. It was unconscious the way shoppers moved aside, creating a clear path down the cereal aisle, as if they were responding to some primal directive to avoid blocking the route of something dangerous, something that required space to operate. Bodies shifted sideways, pressed against shelving, created distance without understanding why. Teenagers who had been filming everything suddenly found reasons to study their shoes. Elderly couples discovered urgent need to examine product labels in distant aisles, but Steven was not looking at the crowd, was not acknowledging their retreat. His entire focus was laser-locked on the three figures at the center of the confrontation, cataloging their positions, their postures, their balance points, and breaking points with the cold precision of a machine designed for violence. Jace still had his hand raised, still had his back turned, still had no idea that death was walking toward him disguised as an aging hippie in a thrift store flannel shirt. Emily huddled against the bottom shelf, still trying to gather her scattered groceries, but something made her look up. Maybe the quality of the silence, maybe the electricity in the air, maybe the same ancestral warning system that was causing the crowd to retreat. Her eyes found Steven approaching, and for a moment her face showed only confusion. This was her grandfather, the man who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings, who fell asleep watching old movies, who complained about his arthritis and forgot to take his blood pressure medication. But this was also someone else, someone she had never seen before, someone whose presence changed the fundamental physics of the space around him. Clay felt at first the weight of being watched by something that saw him not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. His phone trembled in his hand as he turned, seeking the source of his unease. His eyes found Steven, and his face went pale. Jace," he whispered, but his voice cracked, and the words came out as barely audible breath. Benny was already backing away, his earlier bravado evaporating like water on hot asphalt. His round face had gone gray with the sudden understanding that whatever was approaching was not bound by the same rules that governed their usual interactions with the world. Steven took another step, and another, each one precise and measured and inevitable, like the ticking of a clock counting down to some preordained conclusion. His eyes never left Jace's back, never blinked, never showed anything that might be mistaken for mercy or hesitation or human emotion at all. Somewhere in the back of the store, a stock boy dropped a case of bottles, the sound of breaking glass echoing through the aisles like gunshots. But no one turned to look. Everyone was watching the man in the flannel shirt walking toward a confrontation that felt as inevitable as sunrise, as final as gravity. Steven stopped just outside the invisible boundary of personal space that humans maintain without thinking about it, close enough to reach out and touch, close enough to smell the fear that was beginning to leak from Jace's pores like poison sweat, close enough that his presence became undeniable. And finally Jace turned around. The smug arrogance on his face lasted exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for his brain to process what his eyes were seeing, to catalog the stillness, the positioning, the absolute lack of fear or doubt, or anything resembling normal human reaction to confrontation. Then his expression shifted, cycling through confusion to unease to something approaching terror, as some deep animal part of his brain recognized what was standing before him. Steven's voice, when it came, was quiet, conversational, almost polite, the kind of tone someone might use to comment on the weather or ask directions to the nearest gas station. "That's enough." 2 words spoken without heat, without anger, without any emotion at all, but somehow carrying the weight of finality, like the last words spoken before an execution. The kind of statement that brooked no argument, no negotiation, no appeal to mercy or reason. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. The air conditioning cycled on with its familiar mechanical sigh. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed unaware that the world had just tilted on its axis, and Jace, standing face to face with Steven Seagal, finally understood that he had made a terrible mistake. Jace stared at Steven for a long moment, his thick features working through confusion like a computer processing corrupted data. The smirk that had been carved into his face since walking into the store flickered, wavered, then reformed itself into something uglier, something desperate, the kind of expression worn by animals backed into corners who have nothing left but teeth and claws and the willingness to use both. "What did you say, old man?" Jace's voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying the fear he was trying to bury beneath manufactured rage. His chest puffed out in a display of dominance that would have been laughable if it were not so pathetic, like a peacock spreading its feathers in front of a wolf. "You talking to me?" Steven did not move, did not blink, did not acknowledge the question with anything more than the slight tilt of his head that predators use to better hear the heartbeat of their prey. His eyes remained fixed on Jace's face, cataloging micro-expressions, reading the tells that came with adrenaline and fear and the dawning understanding that this was not going to go the way it was supposed to. "Walk away." Steven's voice carried the same conversational tone as before, but underneath the casual words was something else, something that made the fluorescent lights seem to flicker, something that caused several shoppers to take unconscious steps backward, their bodies responding to signals their conscious minds could not yet process. Jace's face twisted into a sneer that looked more like a grimace. "Walk away," he repeated, his voice rising to carry across the store to reach the phones that were recording every word. "You think you can just tell me what to do, Grandpa?" He stepped closer, invading Steven's personal space the way he had done to Emily, breathing his stale energy. Drink breath into the older man's face. "You think because you're big and scary looking I'm supposed to be afraid of you?" Clay and Benny had retreated to the end of the aisle, their earlier enthusiasm for violence evaporating like steam from hot asphalt. Clay's phone shook in his hands as he tried to keep recording, but his survival instincts were screaming at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was about to happen. Benny had gone completely pale, his round face slick with sweat as he pressed himself against a display of breakfast cereals. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of impending violence, but they maintained their distance, forming a loose circle like spectators at a gladiator fight, all of them recording, all of them watching, none of them willing to step forward and intervene. Marla, the cashier, had her finger on the panic button, but found herself frozen by the unfolding drama, her eyes wide with recognition and growing awe. "Oh my God," whispered a woman near the dairy section to her husband. "That's Steven Seagal. That's actually Steven Seagal." "No way," her husband replied, but his voice lacked conviction, his eyes glued to the scene unfolding in the cereal aisle. "That's just some old guy. Look at how he stands," the woman insisted. "Look at his hands." Steven's hands hung loose at his sides, relaxed and ready, the fingers slightly curved, as if holding invisible weapons. Decades of training had burned the positioning into his muscle memory until it was as automatic as breathing. His weight was perfectly distributed, his stance deceptively casual, but containing the potential for explosive movement, like a compressed spring waiting for release. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Emily remained crouched against the bottom shelf, her groceries scattered around her like the debris of a shipwreck, but her eyes were fixed on her grandfather, seeing him in a way she never had before. The man who made her breakfast and helped with her homework had transformed into something else, someone else, and for the first time in her 15 years, she began to understand why he sometimes woke up screaming from dreams he would never discuss, why he kept a loaded gun in the drawer beside his bed, why he insisted on walking her to school, even though she was old enough to go alone. Jace was still talking, still posturing, still trying to convince himself that he was in control. "You know what I think, old man?" he snarled, stepping even closer until he was almost nose to nose with Steven. "I think you're all talk. I think you're just another washed-up has been trying to play hero." He poked Steven in the chest with one thick finger. "I think you should mind your own business before you get hurt." The finger pressed against Steven's sternum was like pressing a detonator. Something shifted in Steven's eyes, something that had been sleeping for years, stirring to wakefulness like a dragon opening one ancient eye. The stillness around him deepened, became something more than mere absence of movement, became a force unto itself, a gravity, well, that seemed to bend reality. Around its edges, last chance. Steven said quietly, the words carried across the store with perfect clarity, despite being spoken barely above a whisper. Every person in the building heard them, felt them in their bones, understood with animal certainty that they had just witnessed the final warning, the last moment when mercy was still possible, when walking away was still an option. Jace's response was to laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound full of false bravado and genuine terror, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have run out of options and are too stupid to realize it. Last chance. He repeated, his voice climbing toward hysteria. What are you going to do? Grandpa beat me up with your walker. Clay whimpered from his position. At the end of the aisle, his phone forgotten in his trembling hands, Benny had begun backing toward the exit, his survival instincts finally overriding his pack loyalty. The crowd held its collective breath, phones steady, recording the moment when words stopped being enough, when civilization's thin veneer finally cracked to reveal the violence that lurked beneath. And then Jace made his fatal mistake. He drew back his fist and threw a clumsy overhand right aimed at Steven's jaw, telegraphing the punch so obviously that even the teenagers filming from the snack aisle could see it coming. The movement was slow, sloppy, born of anger rather than training, the kind of haymaker that worked in bar fights against drunk college kids, but would be useless against someone who had spent decades learning how to hurt people professionally. Steven moved not fast, not dramatically, just efficiently. His left hand came up, deflecting Jace's punch with casual ease, redirecting the momentum so that the bigger man stumbled off balance. His right hand moved at the same time, fingers extended, striking Jace just below the ribs in a precise blow that folded him in half, like a closing jackknife. The sound of the impact was wet and final. Jace's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a silent scream as his diaphragm spasmed, robbing him of breath. He staggered backward, clutching his side, his face cycling through shades of red and purple as his body tried to remember how to breathe. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 seconds. Steven returned to his casual stance, hands loose at his sides, weight evenly distributed, as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just demonstrated that Jace's bluster and posturing were as effective against real violence as tissue paper against a blowtorch. The store was silent again, but this time the silence was different, charged with electricity and possibility and the dawning understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years, something that would be shared and reshared until it became legend. Emily stared at her grandfather with new eyes, seeing past the faded flannel shirt and gray hair to the man underneath, the warrior her mother had told her stories about, but whom she had never really believed existed. And Jace, still gasping for breath, still trying to process what had just happened, made the decision that would seal his fate. He reached for the shopping cart beside him, intending to use it as a weapon, intending to prove that he was not finished, that he would not be humiliated by some old man in front of all these people and their cameras. Steven watched him reach for the cart and smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. The shopping cart felt heavier than it should have in Jace's hands, the metal frame slick with the sweat that had begun pouring from his palms. The moment Steven's first blow had stolen his breath and his confidence, the wheels wobbled as he lifted it, fighting against gravity and his own shaking muscles. His face had gone from red to purple to a sickly gray as his diaphragm slowly remembered its function, each breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded like a broken bellows. He raised the cart above his head in a clumsy overhead swing that telegraphed his intentions to everyone in the store, including the dozen phones that were recording every moment of his humiliation for posterity. The movement was desperate, graceless, the last resort of someone who had run out of options and was too proud or too stupid to simply walk away. Steven watched the cart rise, tracking its trajectory with the dispassionate interest of a mathematician solving an equation. His weight shifted almost imperceptibly to his left foot. His hands remained loose at his sides, but his fingers curved slightly, as if he were holding invisible tools. The old training was fully online now, systems that had been powered down but never truly shut off, awakening with the mechanical precision of a machine designed for one purpose. The cart reached the apex of its arc and began its descent. Steven moved with liquid efficiency, stepping inside Jace's reach as the makeshift weapon whistled past his shoulder, missing by inches. His right hand shot upward, palm open, striking Jace's elbow at the precise angle needed to hyperextend the joint. The sound of cartilage separating was audible even over the mechanical hum of the store's air conditioning. A wet pop that made several witnesses flinch and look away. Jace screamed. The sound was high-pitched and animal, something that belonged in an emergency room or a slaughterhouse, not in the cereal aisle of a family supermarket. The shopping cart tumbled from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor as he clutched his ruined arm to his chest, his face contorting with pain that was beyond his ability to process or understand. But Steven was not finished as Jace stumbled backward, cradling his injured arm. Steven's left leg swept out in a precise arc, catching the bigger man behind the knee. The joint buckled with an audible crack, and Jace went down hard, his skull bouncing off the metal edge of a shelf before his body hit the floor. A rain of soup cans followed, tumbling from their perch to bounce and roll across the aisle like metallic hail. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 5 seconds. Steven stepped back, surveying his work with the calm detachment of a craftsman inspecting a completed project. Jace lay among the scattered cans, groaning softly, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his right leg twisted beneath him in a way that suggested significant damage to the ligaments that held his knee together. Blood trickled from a cut on his scalp where he had struck the shelf, staining his buzz-cut hair dark red. The store was absolutely silent. Even the mechanical hum of the refrigeration units seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Phones trembled in dozens of hands, their cameras capturing every detail of the aftermath, the way Jace's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns, the way his eyes rolled back, showing white, the way Steven stood over him, unmoved and unmovable like a statue carved from granite and disappointment. Clay had dropped his phone entirely, his hands pressed to his mouth, as if he could push back the scream that wanted to escape. Benny had reached the front doors, but found himself frozen, unable to flee, unable to look away, his face the color of old cheese as he watched his friend writhe among the soup cans. Emily remained crouched against the bottom shelf, but her expression had changed from fear to something approaching awe. She was seeing her grandfather the way he had once been seeing the man her mother had described in stories that Emily had always assumed were exaggerated, seeing the warrior who had protected people who could not protect themselves before age and arthritis had forced him into retirement. Marla, the cashier, finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Jesus Christ, she breathed. He's Steven Seagal. He's actually Steven Seagal. The name rippled through the crowd like electricity, passing from mouth to mouth in hushed, urgent tones as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The way he moved, the way he positioned himself, the casual efficiency with which he had dismantled someone half his age and twice as desperate. Suddenly the stories made sense. The movies seemed less like fantasy and more like documentary footage. A teenager near the frozen food section raised his phone higher, trying to get a better angle. Holy shit, dude, this is going viral, he whispered to his friend. This is going to break the internet. Steven ignored the cameras, ignored the whispers, ignored everything except the broken figure at his feet and the granddaughter who was slowly rising from her crouch, her scattered groceries forgotten, her yellow hoodie torn at one sleeve, but her eyes bright with something that might have been pride. Jace tried to sit up, his good hand scrabbling against the linoleum floor for purchase, but the movement sent fresh waves of agony through his ruined elbow and knee. He collapsed back among the soup cans, his breath coming in short, sharp pants that sounded like a wounded animal trying to hide from predators. Please, he gasped, the word barely audible. Please don't. Steven looked down at him, and for a moment something almost resembling pity flickered across his weathered features. You had your chance to walk away, he said quietly. You chose this. And then Jace made his final mistake. With his good hand he reached inside his jacket, fishing for the cheap switchblade he carried for intimidation purposes. His fingers found the handle and began to draw it free, the blade catching the fluorescent light as it emerged, metal bright and sharp and eager. The crowd gasped. Phones adjusted angles to capture what everyone assumed would be Steven's death, the moment when the old man's luck finally ran out, when age and arthritis proved stronger than experience and training. Steven saw the knife, and sighed. It was a sound full of weariness and disappointment, and the tired resignation of someone who had hoped it would not come to this, who had given every opportunity for mercy and been answered with steel. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media, analyzed frame by frame by martial arts experts and armchair warriors, dissected and debated, and ultimately enshrined as one of the most perfect examples of aikido ever captured on camera. Steven's right foot caught Jace's wrist as the knife reached its apex, pinning the weapon against the floor. His left knee dropped onto Jace's solar plexus, driving what little breath remained from his lungs. His right hand found the pressure point below Jace's ear and applied exactly the right amount of force to send him into unconsciousness. The knife clattered harmlessly across the linoleum, coming to rest beside a can of chicken noodle soup. Jace went limp, his body settling among the scattered groceries like a broken mannequin discarded after a store closing. The entire building held its breath. Steven straightened slowly, his joints protesting the sudden exertion. After years of careful retirement, he looked around the circle of faces, phones recording his every movement. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed fully aware of the audience he had acquired. He stepped over Jace's unconscious form and walked to where Emily stood among her scattered groceries, her eyes wide with shock and something approaching worship. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when she woke from nightmares. Emily shook her head, unable to find words. Steven began gathering her scattered items, placing them carefully in her torn canvas tote, his movements deliberate and precise, as if they were performing some sacred ritual in the wreckage of violence. And somewhere in the distance, growing louder by the moment, the sound of sirens began to wail. The sirens were still distant when Jace's eyes fluttered open, consciousness returning in waves of pain and humiliation, and the dawning understanding that everything had gone wrong, that the easy target had become a nightmare, that the simple act of bullying a teenage girl had transformed into something out of his worst fever dreams. His vision swam in and out of focus, settling eventually on the circle of faces staring down at him, phones raised like digital vultures, recording his degradation for an audience that would number in the millions. He tried to sit up, gasping as fresh agony shot through his ruined elbow and knee. His left arm hung useless at his side, the joint swollen to twice its normal size, already turning the deep purple of serious trauma. His right leg would not support his weight, the ligaments torn beyond repair. By Steven's surgical precision, he was broken in ways that would require months of physical therapy and would never quite heal properly, leaving him with permanent reminders of the day he chose the wrong victim. But Jace was not finished. Rage and humiliation and the desperate need to salvage something from this disaster drove him to his feet, using his good arm to lever himself upright against the metal shelving that had opened his scalp minutes earlier. Soup cans scattered under his unsteady movements, rolling away like metallic witnesses fleeing the scene of a crime. His face was a mask of blood and sweat, and the kind of fury that comes from having your entire worldview shattered in the span of 5 minutes. "This isn't over, old man," he snarled, his words slurred by pain and the concussion that was making the fluorescent lights swim like underwater stars. "You think you're tough because you got lucky?" He took a stumbling step forward, his ruined leg dragging behind him like an anchor. "I'm going to destroy you." Steven watched him approach with the patient interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen of self-destruction. His breathing remained slow and controlled, his stance relaxed but ready. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of violence and the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to witness a legend in action. But Steven seemed unaware of the cameras, unaware of anything except the broken young man lurching toward him with murder in his eyes. Emily had retrieved most of her groceries, the cans and boxes that represented her small attempt to take care of her grandfather gathered back into her torn canvas tote. But she remained frozen against the shelving, watching the man who had raised her reveal layers of himself she had never suspected existed, seeing the careful, gentle person who made her pancakes on Sunday mornings transform into something primal and efficient and absolutely terrifying. Jace reached the overturned shopping cart that had started his downfall, and with his good arm, he grabbed it, hauling the metal frame upright despite the screaming protests from his injured body. The cart was dented from its earlier impact, with the floor one while spinning freely, but it was still solid steel, still heavy enough to crush bone if wielded with sufficient desperation. "I'm going to cave your skull in," Jace promised, his voice rising to carry across the store, to reach every phone, every witness, every person who would later claim they had been there when Steven Seagal came out of retirement for one final demonstration. "Then I'm going to do the same to your little bitch granddaughter." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Steven's expression did not change, but something shifted in the quality of his stillness, something that made the fluorescent lights seem to dim and the temperature drop. several degrees. The crowd instinctively took another step backward, their bodies responding to signals their conscious minds could not process. Emily's intake of breath was audible even over the mechanical hum of the store, and somewhere in the distance the sirens grew louder. Jace raised the shopping cart above his head using his good arm and what remained of his functional shoulder muscles to hoist the makeshift weapon high enough to bring it down with bone-crushing force. The movement was clumsy, unbalanced. He was operating on one functional limb, and a concussion and rage that burned through his nervous system like acid, but desperation had given him a kind of manic strength. The cart reached its apex, wobbling dangerously in his grip. Steven moved, not the fluid efficiency of his earlier demonstrations, but something faster, more urgent, the lazy predator. Replaced by something that belonged in nature documentaries about apex predators, he stepped forward and to his right, placing himself at an angle to Jace's attack vector. His left hand came up, catching the shopping cart's frame just behind the handle. His right hand found Jace's wrist. For a moment, they were frozen in tableau, the injured young man straining to bring his weapon down, the older man holding it effortlessly in place like a statue, titled The Futility of Youth or Wisdom, Restraining Folly. The cart trembled between them, caught in a contest of wills and physics that could only end one way. Then Steven twisted. The movement was subtle, economical, using Jace's own momentum against him, redirecting the shopping cart's energy in a direction its wielder had not intended. The metal frame spun out of Jace's grip, carrying him with it. His feet left the ground for a moment as his center of gravity shifted beyond recovery. He hit the shelving hard. The impact sent dozens of cereal boxes tumbling to the floor, a cardboard avalanche of colorful promises and childhood memories. Jace's body folded around the metal edge of the shelf, his ribs compressing with an audible crack that made several witnesses physically recoil. The shopping cart followed him down, its weight adding momentum to the collision. When the dust and debris settled, Jace lay motionless among the scattered breakfast cereals. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns. His face had gone gray, the color of old concrete. His eyes rolled back, showing white. His left arm still hung at that unnatural angle, but now his right shoulder had joined the catalog of injuries torn from its socket by forces his body was never designed to absorb. Steven stood over him, breathing slightly harder than before, but otherwise unmarked by the encounter. His flannel shirt was not even wrinkled. His gray hair remained tied back in its neat ponytail, as if he had just helped an elderly customer reach something from a high shelf rather than systematically dismantling someone a third his age. The store was silent except for the mechanical hum of refrigeration units and the growing wail of sirens approaching from outside. Clay had fled sometime during the final exchange, his loyalty to his friend overcome by his survival instincts. Benny remained by the front doors, but his face had gone green with nausea and the dawning understanding that he was witnessing something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Emily stepped carefully around the debris field of soup cans and cereal boxes to stand beside her grandfather, her canvas tote clutched against her chest like armor, her yellow hoodie torn at one sleeve, but her spine straight, her chin raised with something that might have been pride. "Grandpa," she said quietly. Steven looked down at her, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his expression softened, showing glimpses of the gentle man who read her bedtime stories and helped with her homework and worried about her walking to school alone. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" His voice carried none of the cold efficiency that had characterized his earlier words, only the warmth of a grandfather concerned for his child. Emily shook her head. "I'm okay," she whispered. "But he—" She gestured at Jace's unconscious form. He'll live," Steven said simply. "He'll hurt for a long time, but he'll live." The sirens were very close now. Red and blue lights began flashing through the store's front windows, painting the shelves and the scattered groceries and the broken young man lying among the breakfast cereals in alternating shades of emergency and consequence. Steven placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her away from the wreckage of violence toward the front of the store where paramedics would soon be working to piece together what remained of Jace's ability to function as a human being. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you home." But the crowd was not ready to let them go. Phones continued recording, capturing every step, every gesture, every word as grandfather and granddaughter walked through the aftermath of justified violence toward whatever came next, toward the questions and the paperwork and the inevitable fame that comes from doing the right thing in front of the wrong audience, and behind them among the soup cans and the cereal boxes and the shopping cart that had become a weapon, and then attuned Jace breathed shallow, unconscious breaths that carried the rhythm of hard lessons learned too late. The paramedics arrived like a medical cavalry bursting through Morrison's Family Market's automatic doors with stretchers and equipment bags, and the kind of professional urgency that comes from years of scraping human wreckage off pavements and out of twisted metal. Their boots squeaked against the linoleum as they navigated through the crowd of gawking shoppers, phones still held high, recording every moment of the aftermath. Jace had regained consciousness sometime during the siren's approach, but consciousness was a relative term. His eyes opened and closed in irregular patterns. His mouth worked soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. His left arm remained twisted at that impossible angle, while his right shoulder had settled into a position that suggested permanent dislocation. The blood from his scalp wound had dried into dark streaks down his neck and face, giving him the appearance of a broken statue left out in the rain. "Jesus Christ," the lead paramedic muttered as he knelt beside the wreckage of what had once been a swaggering young bully. "What the hell happened here?" Marla, the cashier, stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "That thug there was beating on a teenage girl," she said, pointing at Emily, who stood beside her grandfather near the magazine rack, and her grandfather intervened. The paramedic looked up at Steven, taking in the faded flannel shirt, the worn jeans, the gray hair tied back in a ponytail, the kind of aging hippie who might be found at farmers markets selling homemade soap or discussing the merits of organic vegetables. But Steven's posture told a different story. The way he held his shoulders, the positioning of his feet, the casual alertness that suggested violence was never more than a heartbeat away. "You do this?" the paramedic asked. Steven nodded, once a simple acknowledgement without elaboration or justification. "Holy shit," the paramedic whispered. "You're Steven Seagal." The name rippled through the crowd again, gaining momentum as more people pulled out their phones, typing frantically, thumbs flying across screens as the story began its viral journey into the digital stratosphere. Within minutes, the footage would be uploaded to every social media platform known to humanity. Hashtag #SeagalJustice. Hashtag Supermarket Samurai. Hashtag Don't Mess with Grandpa, trending across continents as the world witnessed what happened when someone made the mistake of threatening Steven Seagal's family. The second paramedic was working on Jace, checking pupils, measuring pulse, examining the catalog of injuries with professional detachment. "This one's got a dislocated elbow, dislocated shoulder, probable concussion, and what looks like torn ligaments in the knee." He called to his partner. "We're going to need a backboard." Jace tried to speak, his lips moving in shapes that might have been words, but only managed to produce a wet, gurgling sound that spoke of internal damage and the kind of pain that existed beyond the reach of conventional medication. His eyes, when they focused at all, showed the glassy confusion of someone whose understanding of cause and effect had been permanently recalibrated. Steven watched the medical team work with the detached interest of someone observing the aftermath of a natural disaster, something inevitable and ultimately necessary. He felt no satisfaction in Jace's condition, no pleasure in the young man's pain, only the quiet certainty that sometimes violence was the only language that bullies understood. Emily stood close to her grandfather, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the familiar scent of aftershave and old flannel that had meant safety and comfort for as long as she could remember, but now carried undertones of something else, something that spoke of capabilities she was only beginning to understand. "Sir," one of the police officers who had arrived with the paramedics approached Steven with the careful respect reserved for dangerous animals and natural disasters. "We're going to need a statement." Steven nodded. "Of course." The officer was young, probably fresh from the academy, his uniform crisp, his notepad pristine. His hand rested near his service weapon, not threateningly, but with the unconscious awareness that he was dealing with someone who could probably disarm him before he cleared leather. "Can you tell me what happened here?" "He was assaulting my granddaughter," Steven said simply. "I asked him to stop. He refused. I stopped him." The statement was delivered without emotion, without embellishment, the kind of factual recitation that left no room for argument or interpretation around them. The crowd continued, recording, holding their phones like digital torches in the fluorescent glare of the supermarket. Witnesses confirmed that, the officer said, scribbling notes. "But sir, the level of force used here." He gestured at Jace, who was being strapped to a backboard with the care normally reserved for priceless artifacts. This seems excessive. Steven's eyes hardened slightly. He slapped a 15-year-old girl, then threatened to kill us both. His voice remained calm, but carried undertones of steel. I used exactly as much force as necessary to neutralize the threat. Emily stepped forward, her voice clear and carrying despite her youth. Officer, he hit me first. Then, he said he was going to cave my grandfather's skull in and do worse to me. Her words rang with truth and indignation. My grandfather saved my life. The crowd murmured agreement. Phones captured every word as the story solidified into legend. Dozens of witnesses ready to testify that they had seen justice served with surgical precision, that they had watched a predator become prey, that they had witnessed the moment when consequence finally caught up with cruelty. The paramedics were wheeling Jace toward the ambulance, his consciousness fading in and out like a radio station, losing signal. His friends Clay and Benny had vanished into the afternoon, leaving him to face the consequences of their collective stupidity alone, the way bullies always do when the spotlight finally finds them. Sir, the police officer said, closing his notepad, I think we have everything we need. You're free to go, but you may be contacted for follow-up questions. Steven nodded, his hand finding Emily's shoulder, guiding her toward the exit through the crowd that parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Phones tracked their movement, capturing every step as grandfather and granddaughter walked together through the aftermath of justified violence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the parking lot in shades of gold and amber. The sirens were silent now, but red and blue lights continued to flash, painting the supermarket's facade in alternating colors of emergency and resolution. Steven's truck sat waiting in the same spot where he had parked it an hour earlier, when the world was simpler and his secrets were still safe. Emily climbed into the passenger seat, her canvas tote clutched in her lap. The groceries they had come to buy forgotten in the chaos of revelation. She looked at her grandfather as he started the engine, seeing him with new eyes, understanding finally why her mother had spoken of him with such mixture of love and awe. Grandpa, she said quietly as they pulled out of the parking lot, leaving behind the crowd and the cameras and the broken young man who had learned too late that some people are not victims. Mom used to tell me stories about you, but I never believed them. Steven glanced at her, his weathered face softening in the dashboard light. What kind of stories? About how you used to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, about how you were like a superhero, but real. Emily's voice was small but steady. I thought they were just stories. Steven was quiet for a long moment, watching the road ahead as they drove through the small town where he had hoped to live out his retirement in peace. They weren't stories, sweetheart, he said finally. But I hoped you'd never have to see that part of me. Emily reached over and took his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his scarred knuckles. I'm glad I did, she whispered. I'm glad I know who you really are. And as they drove home through the gathering dusk behind them, the story was already spreading across the digital landscape, viral videos and hashtags and millions of views as the world learned that Steven Seagal was not just a movie star, not just a martial artist, but a grandfather who would tear apart anyone who threatened his family. The legend was reborn in a supermarket aisle among soup cans and breakfast cereal, and somewhere in a hospital Jace lay broken and dreaming of a different choice, a different path, a different ending to the story he had written with his fists and his arrogance. But some stories only have one possible ending, and this was always going to be one of them. The footage exploded across the internet like digital wildfire, consuming bandwidth and breaking servers as millions of viewers watched a legend step out of retirement to protect his granddaughter. The original video, posted by a teenager named Marcus who had been buying energy drinks when the confrontation began, accumulated views faster than the platform's algorithms could count. 10,000 in the first hour, 100,000 by evening, 10 million before the sun rose again. On Morrison's Family Market, hashtag Seagal Justice trended worldwide. The comments section became a battleground between those who saw Steven as a hero and those who questioned whether an aging action star had used excessive force against a young man. But the witnesses were clear in their testimonies. The dozens of phones that had recorded every moment told the same story over and over: a grandfather protecting his granddaughter from a violent predator who had been given every opportunity to walk away. Marla, the cashier, found herself thrust into unexpected fame as news outlets tracked Her down for interviews, her voice became the moral center of the narrative, the ordinary person who had witnessed extraordinary justice. He didn't want to fight. She told a reporter from CNN, her weathered face serious in the harsh television lights. You could see it in his eyes. He gave that boy every chance to stop. But when someone threatens a child, when someone raises their hand to hurt an innocent person, while sometimes the only thing bullies understand is strength, the video was dissected, frame by frame, by martial arts experts who marveled at the precision of Steven's techniques, the economy of movement that spoke of decades of training, the way he had neutralized a younger, stronger opponent without apparent effort. Bloggers wrote think pieces about vigilante justice and the responsibility of bystanders. Academics debated the social implications of violence as spectacle, but in a small hospital room across town, none of the digital noise mattered. Jace lay strapped to machines that monitored his vital signs, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning products and the quiet beeping of medical equipment. His left arm was encased in a cast that ran from his fingertips to his shoulder, the elbow joint held together by titanium pins and surgical wire. His right shoulder had been relocated, but the damage to the surrounding tissue would require months of physical therapy and would never quite heal properly. His knee was worse, the ligaments torn beyond simple repair, requiring reconstruction surgery that would leave him with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the day he had chosen the wrong victim. The concussion had been severe enough to cause temporary memory loss, though the doctors assured his mother, who sat beside his bed clutching a tissue box, that most of his cognitive function would eventually return. But Jace remembered enough. He remembered the sound of his elbow separating, the wet pop of cartilage tearing, the moment when his understanding of strength and weakness had been permanently recalibrated. He remembered the calm efficiency with which Steven Seagal had dismantled him, the casual way the older man had stepped over his broken body to check on his granddaughter. He remembered the silence of the crowd, the weight of their judgment, the way phones had turned toward him like accusatory eyes. His mother wept quietly in the chair beside his bed, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She had raised him alone, worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table, sacrificed her own dreams to give him opportunities he had squandered with breathtaking consistency. Why, baby, she whispered, why did you have to hurt that little girl? Jace tried to speak, but his jaw was wired shut. Another consequence of his encounter with the cereal aisle shelving, the words came out as meaningless mumbles, lost in the mechanical rhythm of the machines that were keeping careful track of his damaged body. Clay and Benny had not come to visit. They had watched the video like everyone else, had seen their friend broken and humiliated in high-definition glory, had read the comments calling them cowards for running when the violence turned real. Their absence spoke louder than any apology could have. The brotherhood of bullies dissolved the moment consequences arrived. Wearing a flannel shirt and carrying 40 years of accumulated skill outside the hospital window, the world continued its digital obsession with the supermarket. Samurai t-shirts appeared on street corners bearing Steven's image photoshopped with samurai swords, and kung fu poses. Late-night talk show hosts made jokes about grocery store justice, while morning news programs debated whether ordinary citizens had the right to use violence to protect others. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the simple facts of what had happened in Morrison's family market. But for Steven and Emily, the fame was an unwelcome intrusion into their quiet life. Reporters camped outside their small house on Maple Street, telephoto lenses pointed at windows, hoping to catch glimpses of the reluctant hero who had reminded the world that some people still believed in protecting the innocent. Steven had disconnected the phone after the 15th interview request, had closed the curtains against the prying cameras, had tried to maintain the peaceful routine that retirement was supposed to provide. Emily handled the attention better than he did, her 15-year-old understanding of social media, helping her navigate the comments and the memes and the endless analysis of their story. She read him some of the positive responses, people calling him a hero, thanking him for showing that good people still existed, parents promising to teach their children that bullies could be stopped. Listen to this one, Grandpa, she said, scrolling through her phone as they sat at the kitchen table sharing breakfast like they had every morning for the past 3 years. A woman in California says watching you protect me gave her the courage to leave her abusive husband. She says she realized that if a stranger would fight for someone else's granddaughter, maybe she deserved to fight for herself. Steven looked up from his coffee, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. "That's good, sweetheart, that's real good." But the attention was also bringing out the uglier side of humanity, the keyboard warriors who questioned Steven's motives, who suggested that an old man beating up a young one was somehow unfair, the trolls who called Emily names that made Steven's hands clench into fists that would never again be raised in anger unless absolutely necessary. Some people are saying you're too old to fight. Emily said, her voice carefully neutral. That you got lucky. Steven's response was immediate and definitive. Let them talk, he said quietly. Words don't matter, actions do. I did what needed to be done. And I'd do it again. The local police had reviewed the footage and witness statements, concluding that Steven had acted in defense of others. No charges would be filed, though the district attorney had made a statement about the importance of using only necessary force in such situations. The legal system had spoken, but the court of public opinion would continue its deliberations indefinitely. At the high school Emily attended, the story had made her a celebrity of sorts. Students who had never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to be her friend. Teachers looked at her with new respect, understanding that the quiet girl in the back row came from warrior stock. But Emily navigated the attention with the same quiet dignity she had shown in the supermarket aisle, refusing interviews, declining offers to appear on television talk shows. I'm not the story, she told a persistent reporter who had cornered her outside the school library. My grandfather is a good man who protected his family. That's all anyone needs to know. The reporter had pressed for more details about Steven's background, about his training, about the stories her mother had told her, but Emily had simply walked away, her yellow hoodie now replaced by a new one that Steven had bought to replace the one torn in the confrontation. As the weeks passed, the internet moved on to other outrages, other viral moments, other stories that captured the collective imagination, but the video of Steven Seagal protecting his granddaughter remained a permanent part of the digital landscape, a reminder that heroes still walked among us, disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives. And in Morrison's family market, where it all began, Marla still worked the register. 3, telling anyone who would listen about the day she watched a legend remind the world that some lines should never be crossed. The broken cereal aisle had been cleaned and restocked, but employees still spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. The moment when Justice wore a flannel shirt and moved with the precision of accumulated years. The story had become legend, but for Steven and Emily, it remained simple truth. A grandfather had protected his granddaughter. Everything else was just noise. 3 months after the confrontation, Steven and Emily walked down Maple Street toward Morrison's family market, moving through the golden light of another Sunday afternoon, the same routine that had brought them together with destiny. On that day, when the world learned that retirement did not mean surrender, Emily carried the same canvas tote bag, though it had been carefully mended where Jace's violence had torn the fabric. Steven wore a different flannel shirt, but the same worn jeans, the same scuffed boots that had carried him through decades of service and sacrifice. The reporters had finally moved on to other stories, other heroes, other scandals that demanded the public's attention, but the small town still remembered, still spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed the day Steven Seagal came out of retirement. For 5 minutes, that changed everything. The video still lived online, accumulating views and comments from people around the world who had seen something in those brutal, efficient moments, something that reminded them that good still existed. Grandpa, Emily said as they approached the automatic doors that hissed open with electronic welcome. Do you ever regret it, what you did to him? Steven considered the question as they walked past the magazine rack, where he had first positioned himself 3 months earlier, the same spot where he had made the decision to step forward, to abandon the comfortable anonymity of retirement for the uncomfortable necessity of action. His reflection ghosted across the glass doors like a memory of violence served cold. Regret is for people who had choices, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom and accumulated scars. He made his choice when he raised his hand to you. Everything after that was just consequence. They moved through the store with the easy familiarity of people who belonged here, Emily selecting groceries with the careful attention to budget and nutrition that had become second nature. Steven following at a respectful distance, close enough to protect, far enough to let her maintain the independence that was so important to her sense of self. The other shoppers recognized them, of course. Whispered conversations followed in their wake. Phones appeared and disappeared as people debated whether to record the legend, doing something as mundane as buying milk and bread but Steven had learned to ignore the attention to move through the world as if the cameras did not exist, as if his moment of viral fame was just another mission completed, another threat neutralized. They passed the cereal aisle, where it had all happened, where soup cans and breakfast promises had been scattered. Across linoleum floors painted with blood and justice, the shelves had been restocked, the floor had been cleaned, but Emily still moved a little faster through that section, still carried the memory of fear and the newer memory of protection. I still dream about it sometimes, she admitted as they selected apples with the same careful attention her grandmother had taught her. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams where I see you the way you really are, the way you were before. Steven's weathered hands paused in their examination of the fruit. What do you see in those dreams, sweetheart? I see why Mom always said you were the strongest person she knew, not because of your muscles or your training, but because you chose to use that strength to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Emily's voice was soft, but steady, carrying the kind of understanding that comes from seeing past surfaces to essential truths. I see why she said you were a hero, even when you were just making pancakes and complaining about your arthritis. They continued shopping in comfortable silence, moving through aisles that held the memory of violence, but also the promise of normalcy. Emily gathering the ingredients for Sunday dinner, Steven adding items to the cart with the unconscious precision of someone who had learned to notice everything, to remember everything, to be ready for anything. At the checkout line, Marla was working register 3, as always, her weathered face breaking into a genuine smile when she saw them approach. She had become something of a local celebrity herself, appearing on talk shows and news programs to tell her version of the story, but she had remained fundamentally unchanged, still sharp, still sarcastic, still possessed of the kind of wisdom that comes from watching humanity at its best and worst. Afternoon, Mr. Seagal, Emily, she said as she began scanning their items. Staying out of trouble, I hope. Steven's response was a slight smile that carried decades of dry humor. Trouble seems to find me whether I go looking for it or not. Well, next time it does, I'll make sure to have my phone ready, Marla said with a laugh. That video of you taking down that punk has been viewed more times than the Super Bowl halftime show. Emily helped bag their groceries, her movements efficient, and practiced the same routine they had followed for 3 years, the same domestic ritual that had been interrupted by violence and then resumed as if nothing had changed, because in the end, nothing had changed. Steven was still her grandfather, still the man who made her breakfast and helped with homework and worried about her walking to school alone. But now she understood the weight he carried, the responsibility that came with his particular set of skills, the burden of being someone who could act when others could only watch. As they walked toward the exit, Emily noticed a young woman with a black eye trying to corral 2 small children, while a larger man stood nearby, radiating the kind of casual menace that preceded domestic violence. The woman's movements were careful, controlled, the body language of someone who had learned to avoid triggering explosive anger. Emily felt her grandfather's posture shift slightly, his breathing change, his awareness focus like a laser on the potential threat across the store. She understood now that this was how he moved through the world, constantly cataloging dangers, constantly ready to intervene, constantly carrying the weight of being someone who could not simply ignore injustice. Grandpa, she whispered, I see them. His voice carried the same calm efficiency that had characterized his confrontation with Jace, the same quiet certainty that some things were worth fighting for, but this time the man with the woman seemed to sense something in the air, seemed to feel the weight of being observed by something dangerous. He glanced around the store, his eyes finding Steven's, and recognition flickered across his features, not personal recognition, but the deep animal understanding that he was being evaluated by a predator. The man's demeanor changed, became smaller, less threatening. He took a step back from the woman and children, his body language shifting from dominance to submission under the steady gaze of someone who had reminded the world that bullies were not invincible. The woman never knew how close she had come to witnessing intervention, never understood that a legend had been prepared to step forward on her behalf, but Steven's presence alone had been enough to change the equation, to remind a would-be abuser that there were still people in the world who would not simply look away. They completed their shopping without incident, walking to Steven's truck as the sun painted the parking lot in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had illuminated their journey 3 months earlier when Emily had been just another teenage girl. and Steven had been just another retired grandfather living quietly in a small town. Grandpa Emily said as they loaded their groceries into the truck, "Do you think he'll do it again, that man in there?" Steven considered the question as he started the engine. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but not today, and maybe not tomorrow." Fear is a teacher, sweetheart. Sometimes the only teacher bullies understand. They drove home through streets that looked the same as always, past houses where families were gathered for Sunday dinner, past parks where children played, without understanding how much vigilance was required to maintain their innocence. Emily watched the familiar landscape scroll past, thinking about the weight of protection, about the price of strength, about the quiet heroes who walked among us disguised as ordinary people. "I want to learn," she said, suddenly the words surprising them both. "What, you know how to protect myself and other people?" Steven glanced at her, his weathered face showing surprise and something that might have been pride. "It's not easy, sweetheart. It's not like the movies. It's about discipline and restraint and knowing when not to fight as much as knowing how." "I know," Emily said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "But I also know that sometimes fighting is the only choice. Sometimes someone has to stand up to bullies, and if no one else will, then maybe it has to be me." Steven was quiet for a long moment, watching the road ahead, thinking about legacy and responsibility and the burden of passing dangerous knowledge to someone he loved more than his own life. "We'll start tomorrow," he said finally. "But you have to understand, this isn't about revenge or anger. It's about protection. It's about being strong enough to defend people who can't defend themselves." Emily nodded, understanding that she was asking to inherit more than martial arts techniques, more than fighting skills. She was asking to carry the weight that her grandfather had carried for decades, the responsibility that came with the ability to act when others could only watch. As they pulled into their driveway, past the reporters who had finally given up their vigil, past the curious neighbors who still whispered about living next to a legend, Emily felt something shift inside her, understanding that her childhood was ending, that the innocence that had been shattered in a supermarket aisle was being replaced by something harder, something necessary. "Grandpa," she said as they carried their groceries toward the house where 3 generations of warriors had learned to find peace in small moments. "Thank you for protecting me." Steven stopped on the front porch, his keys halfway to the lock. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying all the love and wisdom of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness but still believed in its light. "Protecting you isn't something I do, it's who I am." And as the sun set over their small town, painting the sky in shades of promise and memory, grandfather and granddaughter walked into their house together, carrying groceries and secrets, and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for. The legend lived in quiet moments between the violence and pancakes on Sunday morning, in homework help and bedtime stories, in the simple act of one generation teaching the next that strength without compassion was meaningless, that true warriors fought only when they had to, and that sometimes the greatest victory was the fight that never happened because the right person was watching, ready to act if necessary, but hoping, always hoping that it would not be. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.